Welcome to another episode of Philosophy and Critical Thinking. In this video, we are going to think about philosopher Linda Zagzebski's article, Virtue Ethics. So what is virtue ethics? Virtue ethics is a theory of what it is to be a good person. It's a moral theory. The moral theories that we've been thinking about up to this point have been moral theories of right action. So consequentialism and utilitarianism, Kant's ethical theory. These are theories of what it is to be a right action. Right? So does the action produce better overall consequences than all the relevant alternatives? Is the action based on what Kant calls the categorical imperative? These questions can help us figure out whether an action was right or not. Virtue ethics, though, is not a theory of right action. Rather, it's a theory of what it is to be a good person. All right, so the theory says that a good person is someone who possesses the virtues, commendable traits of character like courage, bravery, compassion, curiosity, so on and so forth. All right, in this article, Zagzebski is going to explain to us ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle's theory of virtue, and she offers her own explanation of why virtue ethics isn't all that popular nowadays. Used to be very popular in ancient societies, but what happened? Right? In her view, we would do well as a society to return to thinking about virtue and the central role of virtue in living a happy, flourishing life. And in Zagzebski's view, the fact that we don't think in terms of virtue all that much anymore is partly the reason why our society is so polarized. She thinks that we tend to frame ethical debates solely in terms of rights and duties nowadays, and this has made it almost impossible for people to find consensus or to reach understanding on important social, ethical, and political issues. All right, so let's first talk about Aristotle's theory of virtue. All right, so Aristotle says in his most important work on ethics, called the Nicomachean Ethics, that every human desires what the ancient Greeks called eudaimonia. Eudaimonia is translated in English as happiness or flourishing. It's important to stress, though, that the way the ancients thought about eudaimonia was not that it was a kind of temporary feeling or psychological state of mind that you could have just in an instant. To be happy, according to Aristotle, to really flourish as a human being, is not to just experience one temporary state of satisfaction or joy, but rather to be engaged in a kind of temporally extended activity throughout one's life, a kind of activity that was deeply fulfilling and meaningful. Aristotle thought that in order to determine what it is to live well, to flourish, to really be happy as a human being, we have to ask the question, what is the function of a human being? Right? So according to Aristotle, the function of a thing is just what the thing does that makes that thing distinctively the kind of thing that it is. So for a plant, the function of a plant is living a life of growth, photosynthesis, just growing as a plant. For an animal, the function of an animal is sense perception and reproduction. These are what make animals distinctive. What makes humans distinctive creatures is that we have a capacity for reason. So Aristotle says that rational activity is what distinguishes us from everything else. All right, so Zagzebski talks about what's sometimes called Aristotle's function argument. This is an argument that concludes that eudaimonia for human beings consists in what Aristotle calls rational activity in accordance with virtue over a complete life. Right? So Aristotle's argument runs as follows. He says, every being has a good that consists in fulfilling its function. The function of a being is what is distinctive of it. What is distinctive of humans is rational activity or the power of reason. To perform a function well requires the appropriate virtues or excellencies of character. Therefore, the final human good is rational activity in accordance with virtue over a complete life. All right, so Aristotle offers an example of a musician. He says the function of a musician is to play music. The function of an excellent musician is to play music well. An excellent musician would perform with excellence due to the relevant virtue of skill. Now, the function of an excellent human being in general is to just live a life of rational activity and to do this well and finely. In other words, to live a life in accordance with virtue, because virtues are the traits of character that constitute excellent thought and action. In Aristotle's view, there's a distinction to be drawn between intellectual virtues and moral virtues. Intellectual virtues are things like curiosity, understanding, open-mindedness. Moral virtues are things like courage, generosity, friendliness, self-control, patience, civility. Virtues aren't innate in Aristotle's view. They're things that we need to work at. We need to cultivate virtue in order to become better humans. We all have the capacity or the ability to develop virtues, but we need to expose ourselves to situations that allow virtue to develop. So some habits impart virtues, other habits work against virtues. For example, if I develop the habit of paying attention to other people's needs, then I'm more likely to become more generous. If I develop the habit of never trying anything new, then I won't learn certain kinds of courage. If I develop the habit of always giving in to the temptation to check my phone whenever I receive a notification, I'll never cultivate patience or self-control. Aristotle offers an analysis of what virtues are, and it's called the golden mean analysis. The basic idea is that a virtue lies at the midpoint between two extremes, one of excess and one of deficiency. So the best way to think about this is to consider a specific kind of character trait where you could be deficient in the character trait, you could be excessive in the character trait, or you could be right at the midpoint between those two extremes. So take a character trait like courage. Right? That's a virtue. According to Aristotle, the excess of courage is recklessness. Right? So having like too much of the relevant character trait. Imagine someone at a bar with their friends and a fight breaks out, and before even sizing up the situation, they just jump into the middle of the fight and start throwing punches. That's just reckless. Can also imagine someone responding in the following way. The fight breaks out and they just run as quickly as possible away because they're scared. That's a deficiency of courage. That's just cowardice. So courage lies at the midpoint between excess and deficiency, between recklessness and cowardice. For another example of this, think about friendliness. Friendliness is a virtue, but you can be too friendly with others, can't you? Imagine a person always commenting on another person's appearance. I love the way your hair looks today. I love your shirt. I can't believe you got such a high score on the exam. Right? That's too much friendliness. That's what we call flattery. That's an excessive amount of friendliness. You could also be deficient in friendliness. Maybe you're cold around others. You're mean. To be friendly is to occupy the midpoint between these two extremes of excess and deficiency. Okay, so Aristotle's view is that it's very important to be reflective and think about the virtues that either I am excelling at or that I'm deficient in or being excessive about. If I notice that on the spectrum of, say, courage, I'm too much of a coward, then I need to try to put myself in situations that will allow courage to be cultivated. I need to work at becoming more courageous. And the reason to do this is that being the kind of person that exhibits virtue is simply worthwhile for its own sake. In Aristotle's view, to really live a flourishing life requires that I cultivate virtue and that I work at becoming a better person. In his view, it's constitutive of living a flourishing life that I exhibit virtue in my activities. All right, so that's Aristotle's theory of virtue, very condensed version. All right, let's think a little bit about Zagzebski's analysis of the breakdown of virtue during the Age of Enlightenment. So she gives a really kind of fascinating historical explanation of why virtue fell out of favor during the Enlightenment period. Her idea is something like this. During the Enlightenment, there was a huge amount of global trade. Rather than just trading, within a nation with other people, nations started to trade internationally. Right? And this led to what's called social contract theory, right? A kind of theory that's based on self-interest, where the idea is that there's a contract that we implicitly agree to. I'm not going to steal your things if you don't steal my things. The idea is that the focus was on individual autonomy and the demands of the self. Duties and rights are the central concepts in social contract theory rather than virtues and the well-being of persons and their communities. So Zagzebski offers 3 examples of contemporary ethical, social, and political issues where it might look kind of obvious that the debate surrounding these issues is cashed out exclusively in terms of rights and duties rather than in terms of virtues. So she suggests that debates about gun rights and rights to free speech and abortion rights are like this. If you think about the gun issue, right? The gun issue is framed as an issue between some people who think that we have a right to own guns and others who think that we don't have a right to own guns. When it comes to free speech, the issue is cashed out in terms of some people thinking we have a right to say hate speech, for instance, and other people who think that we shouldn't have a right to hate speech. When it comes to abortion, the issue is framed in terms of a fetus's right to life versus a mother's right to decide what happens to her body. Right? So in each of these cases, the issues are framed in terms of rights. And for every right that there is, there's a corresponding duty. So if you have a right to X, then I have a duty to not prevent you from getting X. Roughly, that's the basic idea. From the virtue perspective, though, the fact that someone has, say, a right to say nasty or offensive things is beside the point. Right? It's uncivil or it's unkind to say nasty, offensive things. There seems to be many areas in contemporary society where we are totally lacking in virtue. Think about patience, for instance. Amazon used to have shipping that would get there in 3 days and people were fine with that. And then it was, next day shipping. Now it's same day shipping. Now it's shipping within the next 4 hours, right? Or 2 hours in some cases. We are not going to be able to cultivate patience if we are so concerned with instant gratification. Self-control, focus, focusing attention. These are virtues. Think about how easy it is to be distracted when trying to, say, read a book or to just think. It can be very difficult given all the distractions, notifications on one's phone, social media. These can work against virtues like self-control, patience, and focused attention. Or think about how people behave with one another in, say, the comment section on YouTube. Totally uncivil. People don't engage with one another in kind ways. or in generous ways. That is, generously interpreting what someone might mean when they make a comment. And so there are many ways, it seems, that discussion of virtue could potentially help when it comes to combating intense polarization in society on important ethical and social and political issues. All right, so despite the historical fact that virtue ethics largely fell out of favor during the Age of Enlightenment, it seems like Zagzebski gives us some really persuasive and compelling reasons to think that it would be a good idea to bring virtue ethics back.